Hi, everybody. This is Regina Feeney, librarian and archivist at the Freeport Memorial Library. Today, I'm going to be doing a program on the history of temperance and the prohibition movements in the village of Freeport. This program came out of a program that we did with the Freeport Historical Society several years ago. It was an outside the lines program where you took a library program and brought it into the community. So we put together a program on the history of prohibition, and we did it at a bar on Woodcliffe Canal. While I was doing the research for that presentation, I kept finding information about these temperance movements that occurred within the village of Freeport, which I found really surprising because Freeport has this reputation of being a place where there was a lot of rum running and bootlegging going on in the 1920s and early 1930s. So I was kind of shocked to see that there was a lot of anti-liquor agitation within the village of Freeport early on. So when I went back to school and started to get my master's in history, I decided to explore this temperance movement in the village of Freeport. And so this presentation is part of my master's research. So I want to start by reading you the introduction to my master's thesis. Prohibition has been described as the noble experiment. For more than 13 years, the law that was supposed to keep the United States dry appeared to have the opposite effect. New York City was the largest point of entry for liquor during Prohibition. Most of this contraband came by sea. With its 1,180 miles of beaches, estuaries, canals, and other waterways, Long Island served as the distribution point for nearly 1/3 of the liquor that found its way into the city. Like many waterside Long Island communities located in close proximity to Manhattan, the village of Freeport played an important role in the unlawful transportation and distribution of alcohol. By 1923, Freeport was known as the Rum Runners' Port, and Merrick Road, its main thoroughfare, was nicknamed Bootleggers Boulevard. Most histories discuss how Long Islanders violated the law through the illegal consumption of alcohol and their participation in and profiting from rum running activities. Few histories explore the broad support of anti-liquor legislation by Long Islanders. Freeport's notorious reputation as a community of Volstead Act violators is unfair and inaccurate because it was developed primarily from Prohibition-era histories. The 19th and early 20th century media focused on the temperance effort of churches, social organizations, and the government is wholly absent from the historical record. Early temperance accounts illustrate how churches encouraged individual responsibility and supported the organization of temperance societies, which in turn advocated for government intervention. This lecture traces the early roots of the temperance movement on Long Island and how Freeporters reacted to alcohol legislation and anti-liquor agitation. Temperance is defined as the avoidance of excess drinking. By 1830, temperance was synonymous with moderation. After 1830, total abstinence became a guiding principle of the temperance movement. Temperance occurred in two ways: moral suasion or legal coercion. Moral suasion involves attempting to change bad behavior by appealing to a person's conscience. Legal coercion involves the elimination of vice through legislation. Coercive measures began in the mid-1840s when the state of Maine passed laws prohibiting alcohol. Other states attempted to follow Maine's footsteps through the passage of the Maine laws. These prohibitory laws were usually overturned quickly. Total prohibition would finally be achieved through legal coercion in 1920 with the passage of the 18th Amendment. Early histories about New York often state that the name Manhattan was derived from an Indian word, which meant the island or place of general intoxication. Well, today, the preferred translation of Manhattan is Hilly Island. From the laws and decrees passed in the 17th and 18th century, religious institutions and local government attempted to control and curtail people's drinking habits. In 1644, we also see an early attempt to supplement the government's coffers with money derived from taxes on alcoholic beverages. In 1651, a local government in Suffolk County passed an ordinance to control access to alcohol. Native Americans are prohibited from purchasing alcohol in 1655. In 1664, the town of Hempstead is mentioned in an ordinance against the manufacture and sale of malt liquors in New York. In 1712, we see an early attempt to license establishments that sell alcohol. Fines are enacted on New Yorkers who imbibe to excess. Often access to alcohol is controlled on a class basis. A law in 1738 is an example of how the government's attempts to restrict servants and apprentices. Wealthy property owners' access to alcohol is rarely restricted. Dr. Benjamin Rush, in addition to signing the Declaration of Independence, was a physician. He gave Thomas Paine the title for his publication, Common Sense. The Pennsylvania Historical Society has 45 volumes of his writings. He helped found Pennsylvania's first society to oppose slavery. He is credited with writing the first chemistry textbook in America, possibly the first person ever to write about and describe the game of golf in the U.S. He supported better education for women, opposed capital punishment, and sought to improve prison conditions. In 1784, Dr. Benjamin Rush also published the pamphlet entitled An Inquiry into the Effects of Ardent Spirits upon the Human Body and Mind. He argued that ardent spirits, which we know today as distilled liquors, were dangerous, whereas fermented beverages, wine and beer, were beneficial. By 1850, Rush's pamphlet sold more than 170,000 copies. Benjamin Rush is also credited with looking at alcoholism as a disease and not a moral failing. Temperance begins in the Northeast in the early 19th century. By the end of the century, the Midwest takes the lead. New York was a groundbreaker in temperance. This may have had to do with the Second Great Awakening that began around 1800s. Religious enthusiasm in Western New York was called the Burned Over District due to the many revivals that took place there. Religious revivalism is said to have spread across the street like a prairie fire. This movement peaked between 1825 and 1837 as people flocked to upstate New York due to the construction of the Erie Canal. By the mid-1820s, an abundant grain harvest combined with an efficient transportation and better distillation technology left New York flooded with cheap liquor. New York may have needed the moral suasion provided by the itinerant preachers to help curtail vice. Though evangelicalism is mostly associated with Western and rural New York City became a leading center of the movement in 1825. By 1830, religion found its way to Raynor South. In 1851, Maine became the first state in the Union to prohibit the manufacture and sale of alcohol. Over the next 4 years, 12 states and territories would follow, passing what is commonly referred to as the Maine Law. New York attempted prohibition in 1855 with the passage of the New York Prohibitory Liquor Law, an act for the prevention of intemperance, pauperism, and crime. Temperance leaders celebrated and commissioned a commemorative token. However, this temperance victory was short-lived. New York overturned the prohibitory law the same year. The cover of this law shows the emphasis placed on the word intemperance. Alcohol was associated with many of society's ills, including destitution, crime, and pauperism. Jails and poorhouses in New York were said to be filled with those who imbibed too many intoxicating drinks. The connection between drinking and bad fortune would not have gone unnoticed in Freeport. In the 1850s, Queens County established an almshouse in Freeport. It was locally referred to as the Benedict Farm, since it was run by Francis K. Benedict. According to the New York Census of inmates in almshouses and poorhouses, 1830 to 1920, 12 of these records identify inmates from the Freeport poorhouse. Their dependency was attributed to insanity in 8 cases, insanity intemperance in 3 cases, and 1 case of destitution. Temperance comes to Long Island. The first mention of temperance on Long Island appears in Nathaniel Prime's 1845 History of Long Island. According to Prime, temperance first came to Long Island on November 5, 1811. In the town of Aquabog, located in Suffolk County, the local Presbyterian church preached a sermon on the subject of intemperance. The next day, a pastoral letter condemning alcohol was drafted and unanimously accepted. According to Prime, these church members were influenced by Dr. Rush's pamphlet. Other examples of temperance on Long Island. The first is in 1842, Long Islander Walt Whitman wrote a temperance novel called Franklin Evans or the Inebriate. The story is about a young man living in Suffolk County in the 1830s who travels to the city and how calamity befalls him when he starts drinking. Unfortunately, Whitman famously called the novel damn rot and said that he drank heavily for the 3 days it took him to write the book. Another example of temperance on Long Island is painter William Sidney Mount, who was born in Setauket. He had two paintings featuring intemperance. The first is called The Barroom Scene, and the other is Loss and Gain. In 1857, Mount wrote in a letter saying, drinking causes one to be stupid and to lose ambition about business and indifference about personal appearance. East Hampton's ordinance in 1651 said basically that liquor could not be sold to youths and those under other men's management. These would be servants. And that servants could not drink at unreasonable hours. It also stated that a party of 4 servants could not have more than half a pint of liquor between them. In 1829, we see the birth of temperance societies in Freeport, beginning in 1829 with the Sag Harbor Temperance Society. Between 1790 and 1830, Suffolk County had the largest population on Long Island. Suffolk was also home to Long Island's second largest industry after farming, whaling. According to the Whaling Museum and Education Center of Cold Spring Harbor, whaling put Long Island on the economic world map. Its presence on Long Island not only shaped the economy, but also the social life of Long Islanders. Long Island held 3 of the 72 whaling ports in the country. Sag Harbor ranks 6th in the nation in the number of vessels and number of voyages. Greenpoint ranked 17th, and Cold Spring Harbor ranked 27th. In 1966, a researcher explained the existence of temperance in Suffolk in an article in the East Hampton Corrector. The researcher stated, pastors of both Protestant and Catholic churches agreed upon the necessity for temperance, especially in a seaport like Sag Harbor, where unattached men of all races came and went. Sag Harbor's whaling peaked around 1845. Greenport's whaling industry dissolved in 1859, and Cold Spring Harbor closed its whaling company in 1862. The first documented temperance movement in the town of Hempstead occurred in 1831. At this time, residents met at the Episcopal Church in the village of Hempstead and discussed the formation of a county temperance society. The Sons of Temperance, which formed in New York City in 1842, was one of the first to call for total abstinence of alcohol. A chapter was established in 1869 in Hempstead, and according to an 1882 description of the organization, it had nicely furnished rooms over the post office at the corner of Main and Front Streets, where regular meetings are held each Monday evening. Okay, so you probably, if you hadn't seen it, I did a program on called Freeport Walks into a Bar, where I talk about early drinking establishments in Freeport. And you'll know from that program that terms like tavern, inn, house, and hotel were used in the 1800s to describe places where alcohol was sold. By 1830, the annual per capita consumption of absolute alcohol by Americans was nearly 4 gallons. It is also at this time, more and more people began to purchase alcoholic beverages rather than produce them at home. So where did Freeporters drink and purchase their liquors? Surprisingly enough, The first place we have found was at Freeport's first school. This is the first documented place. In 1911, Freeporter A.J. Smart wrote his recollections about attending Freeport's one-room schoolhouse in 1839. And he said that north of the school was a tavern. And according to Smart, indeed, I have seen a teacher send a boy for a mug of beer, which he would drink in the presence of the school. In describing Freeport further, Smart said, at this time, the people, as the school would indicate, were quite primitive. They saw but little of the outer world, their support being obtained principally by fishing and hunting in the Great South Bay. They knew no moral or religious restraints as a people. Their highest pleasures were found in convivial association and rough physical sport in and about the taverns, which were very numerous. Here is a closer look at the tavern located nearest to Freeport's one-room schoolhouse. This hotel or tavern was owned by Benjamin Smith. Later, it was owned by James Mead. It was located on the east side of the intersection of North Main Street and Broadway. In 1900, the Freeport Methodist Church published a pamphlet that recalled early Freeport. Hotels in the early 1880s were described this way. The country hotel or tavern in ye olden times was not much for comfort to the traveler, but as a place of amusement and entertainment of the community, where frolics were wont to be held. It would have served a good purpose had it avoided the sale of liquors, but like the country store, here also it was indispensable. Raynor Mead was a store and tavern located in Raynor South, now Freeport, operated by Raynor Riley and James Mead. In the early 1830s, a stagecoach operated between Raynor South and Hempstead. Passengers were picked up 3 times a week from Raynor and Mead's storefront. At Hempstead, a connection could be made to Brooklyn. In the Methodist publication from 1900s, Freeport's 2 general stores are also described as follows. As far back as the memory of my informant, in 1837, Raynor Town had 2 general stores. The larger of the 2 was that kept in a building still standing on what is now Pine Street and Church and Main Streets. It was kept by Riley Raynor and John Mead. Its stock was not large, but answered the people's necessities: dry goods, boots and shoes, hardware, etc. And last but not least, we are sorry to say, the indispensable annihilator, liquors. No matter how strongly Freeporters embraced temperance causes, liquor establishments were never far away. Roosevelt, as it is known today, is in the northern boundary of Freeport. In the early 19th century, this small hamlet had a more sinister name, Rum Point. This colloquial designation is believed to derive from an inn or tavern located at the intersection of 4 roads, which are at the heart of this place. According to one account, it is said that more rum was drank in the good old or bad old days at this hotel than any other crossroads tavern in the town. In the early 1830s, when the temperance fervor was at its height in New York State, calls to change Rum Point's name to Greenwich began to appear in local tabloids. One letter to the editor said this: "Is it not the very fact of living in a place known as Rum Point a suspicious circumstance?" But not all thought that such a name change would curtail drinking habits. In 1845, Nathaniel Prime recounted a visit to the neighborhood several years earlier, when he, quote unquote, saw 3 men literally reeling through the streets. Rum Point eventually became Greenwich Point and later Roosevelt, but the tavern at the center of this controversy stayed in business until it burned down in 1901. Let's talk a little bit about taverns and democracy. Taverns and inns have been seen by temperance leaders as places of vice, but they also did serve an essential public purpose. Lifelong Freeporter William Golder wrote in his simple biography his recollections of the presidential elections in 1864. So if you wanted to remember that one, 1864 was the presidential election where Abraham Lincoln went up against George B. McClellan. William Golder says this: the presidential election of 1864, Cousin Charlie and I went up the street to the corner of Merrick Road and Main Street, where there was drum music opposite the hotel where voting took place. This hotel was most likely the Central Hotel, and which was managed by B.T. Smith. The hotel was located on the southwest corner of South Main Street and Fulton Street, now Merrick Road. In 1864, the local excise commission granted this hotel a liquor license. In 1862, Thomas Baldwin's Hotel, located just west of Freeport in Baldwinsville, now Baldwin, was used by the Queens County tax collector as a location to receive tax payments. That same year, a liquor license was granted to Baldwin's Hotel. In 1860, a liquor license would have cost $30 for a tavern and $40 for a store. By May 1860, total receipts in Queens County were about $2,500 for all those liquor licenses. In the 1880s, the oyster industry became regulated and required a license. The same Central Hotel that was the site of the 1864 presidential election was also the location where local baymen could apply for oyster licenses. To understand temperance better, these reform movements need to be examined not as an evolution, one movement causing the next, but rather as movements that had their own genesis, agenda, and lifestyle. Historian Jack S. Blocker looked at temperance nationally and identified 5 distinct cycles of reform. However, Blocker believed that different periodization could easily produce other cycles and different progression within some cycles. Applying these periodization models to Freeport, one discovers 4 distinct temperance cycles. So let's begin with the first one, which is churches and fraternal organizations. Freeport chronicler A.J. Smith described in the 1830s the arrival of the Methodist Church in Freeport, bringing about positive changes. Then came the Methodists, said Smart, and the church influence advanced, and the people became enlightened, and the hotel influence declined, until today, when the moral turn of the community is such as to cause every hotel in the village to close its front doors on Sundays, not because of any legal restraint, but because the advanced moral sentiment of the community. Another Freeport chronicler, Daniel Treadwell, describes Freeport in this period of time prior to the arrival of the Presbyterian pastor as a place of religious destitution. He went on to say, horse racing on Saturdays was a favorite recreation of the people. They'd been familiar with it from infancy, and so no harm in it. But when they began to observe the good and orderly conduct of the church-going people, and when their children brought home moral lessons learned in Sunday school, their reason became active, and horse racing was discontinued without any law being enacted for its suppression. Treadwell also recalled temperance agitation in Freeport beginning in the 1840s with pledges to abstain from intoxicating liquors. Temperance did change the habits of 2 Freeporters. Treadwell identifies Joseph Smart and Riley Raynor as the 2 best-known abstainers and temperance supporters in Freeport. As you may recall, Riley Raynor was the owner of Raynor Mead's store that sold ardent spirits. Treadwell also recalled a famed temperance speaker coming to Freeport. In the 1840s, Alexander Sandy Welsh, a reformed rum seller in New York, spoke in a Freeport church. He attracted such a large crowd that many of the attendees were forced to listen to him speak through the open doors and windows. 2/3 of the audience signed pledges to abstain from alcohol. Joseph Smith would later discontinue selling liquor in his store. Freeport's consumption and sale of alcohol did not go unnoticed by the local media. As the Washingtonians, an organization that supported total abstinence from intoxicating beverage, sought converts to their cause on Long Island, one newspaper reported in 1842, "We understand that the Washingtonians of Hempstead and Jamaica are making preparations to storm the enemy camp at Raynor South." The following year, the Washingtonian Societies of Queens adopted its constitution. In 1845, the New York State Legislature passed a law requiring each of the 858 townships in the state, except for New York City, which was voted an exemption, to hold a paper ballot election in May 1846, for the purpose of deciding whether or not town officials should issue licenses for the retail sale of strong drinks. Of the 813 towns whose results are available, 651, or 80%, voted against alcohol. Basically, they voted in favor of local prohibition. The town of Hempstead was one of 2 Queens County townships that voted in favor of licensing. Basically, they voted to remain wet. So it was the town of Hempstead and the town of Jamaica. Historian W.J. Rohrabaugh argued that communities located near the canal system or railroads were more likely to vote against licensing in the sale of liquor. Although railroad service in the town of Hempstead began in 1839, the southern part of the township had to wait until 1863 when the South Side Railroad first came to Freeport. Around that time, Freeporters relied on stagecoaches and plank roads for travel. Rohrabaugh found that the more isolated a community was, which Freeport would have been, the more likely that the community would vote wet, because drinking was part of their tradition and they were not willing to give it up. Aside from anecdotal accounts, the temperance movement in the village of Freeport is absent from all formal histories about Long Island and Prohibition. Here one can rely on local newspaper accounts. The Long Island Farmer and Queens County Advertiser document one of the earliest temperance meetings in Freeport. A monthly meeting of the Queens County Temperance Society occurred in the village in September 1861. In 1870, the Jamaica Farmer reported an attempt to create a temperance society in Freeport. And it says this: "We understand a movement is afoot to organize a temperance society at Freeport. We are glad to hear it. A society of this kind would afford an agreeable method for spending long winter's evenings." 4 years later, the New York Herald reported that a prohibitory union of Freeport had adopted a constitution and bylaws, and it was determined to run a separate ticket in every political election. Nothing more was ever reported about the Freeport Temperance Society or the Prohibitory Union of Freeport. It was not until 1880 that a more lasting temperance movement took root in Freeport. On May 7, 1880, the Sincerity Lodge number 236, the Independent Order of Good Templars, was established in Freeport. It was the first Templars Lodge to be instituted in Queens County. The Independent Order of Good Templars originated in Utica in 1851. Unlike other fraternal temperance organizations like the Washingtonians and the Sons of Temperance that maintained separate auxiliaries for women, the Templars broke from tradition and allowed women full membership. Though the lodge boasted it had 60 members for its 16th anniversary, the Freeport chapter had all but disappeared by 1900. In 1885, during its peak, the Sincerity Lodge held a Templars convention in the Freeport Presbyterian Church. During the meeting, a lively discussion took place on the topic of the rights of liquor dealers as citizens. A total ban on alcohol was supported by those who believed that a man who sold rum could never be a good citizen unless he reformed and gave up the business. Those that disagreed argued liquor dealers had the rights and duties as citizens, and if they strictly observed the requirements of the law, they should be looked upon as better citizens than those who violated the law. The matter of liquor being banned outright or being better regulated was not resolved during this Freeport convention. This dry versus wet debate would continue nationally for decades. In 1896, local licensing in New York State ended with the adoption of the Raines tax law. Its purpose was to end local corruption that permeated the issuing of liquor license. In Albany, voting for the legislation fell along party lines. Republican members of the Senate and Assembly voted for the law, and all Democrats voted against it. It passed. In addition to appointing a state excise commissioner, the Raines law prohibited all-night licenses and the sale of liquor on Sundays, except in hotels that had at least 10 guest rooms, and maintained that saloons cannot be less than 200 feet from a church or school. The law also raised the legal drinking age in New York from 16 to 18. License fees were based on population size. So with a population of 2,250 in 1896, It would have cost a Freeport establishment about $210 to sell liquor. The Raines law provided to be quite profitable for the state and county coffers. Under the Raines law, 2/3 of the revenue collected by the state went to the local county. Less than 3 months after the law went into effect, New York State reported that it had collected over $10 million in revenues. Senator John Raines believed that the legislation would help reduce the number of places where liquor was sold. The law may have had this desired outcome in Freeport. In May 1896, the Brooklyn Daily Eagle reported, quote, "The effect of the Raines tax law has already been greatly felt in this village by saloon keepers. The Freeport House, one of the principal hotels in this section today, removed all intoxicating liquors from the bar, and the other saloons are disposing of any of all their intoxicants. Elsewhere in the county, alcohol providers grew concerned. One headline read, 'Rockaway liquor dealers quake.' The same newspaper reported that the stress of the law was so great on an East New York saloon keeper that the man began to imbibe too much of his own stock and ended up in a sane asylum." Alcohol regulations did have an impact on some liquor dealers in the village. However, the impact of temperance on local culture is also evident. In 1896, Freeport's ever-ready hose company performed the temperance drama Ruined by Drink. Performed in the local opera house and using local talent, this performance helped raise much-needed funds for the Freeport Fire Department. In Freeport, the Freeport Club was a men's organization. In 1903, the clubhouse was built on Grove Street, now Guy Lombardo Avenue, just south of Sunrise Highway. It was founded as a temperance club, which meant they did not serve alcohol. In 1911, some of the members hoped to change the rules. 140 votes cast, 78 were in favor of alcohol, 52 were against, but they needed 87 votes to amend the club's bylaws. George Wallace, one of the club's organizers, said of the club that the club had been founded and started as a temperance club, and he saw no reason for changing. Well, eventually, the club lost many of its membership, and by 1921, the club had become a Masonic lodge. Cycle 2, the Women's Christian Temperance Union. The Women's Christian Temperance Union played a significant role in the spreading of the temperance message. What is known about the Women's Christian Temperance Union in Freeport is found entirely in local newspaper archives and Freeport Village government documents. The Freeport Women's Christian Temperance Union was established sometime around 1897. Nationally, there are no studies concerning the demographics of members of the W.C.T.U. Before 1920, the W.C.T.U. leadership consisted of women who were educated Protestant, native-born, and married to men with middle-class occupations. Details gleaned from local newspaper articles and obituaries indicate the profile of Freeport's W.C.T.U. leadership followed the national model. It is interesting to note that the husbands of many of W.C.T.U. members were also very politically and socially active. Unlike its rural counterparts, the Freeport W.C.T.U. did not threaten local ballrooms with hatchets like Carrie Nation, nor did it conduct sidewalk prayer services outside saloons. Rather, its early social reform appeared to be limited to civic improvements. In 1900, Freeport's W.C.T.U. helped raise $150 for the purchase of a 5-foot bronzed iron fountain to be centrally located and used for the use of horses and the 1,000 of wheelmen who used the famous Merrick Road. The wheelmen they're referring to are bicyclists, and in 1900 there was a huge bicycle craze, and many of these bicyclists traveled from the city out onto Long Island using Merrick Road. In 1903, the W.C.T.U. asked the village board to aid them in the suppression of sale of cigarettes to our village, to children under the age of 16. Okay, so sorry. Okay, sorry about that. I just lost track of my slides. Okay, so in 1912, the first syndicated W.C.T.U. column appeared in the Nassau County Review. By this time, the Freeport W.C.T.U. had moved away from dedicating fountains and protecting miners from cigarettes and began calling for prohibition. In 1914, we begin to see syndicated columns in local newspapers. Before then, the coverage was limited to Freeport W.C.T.U. activities. In this article, the W.C.T.U. attacks the trade periodical, the Brewers Journal. And so these articles become a much more managed message. Okay, temperance comes to Freeport. This is the cycle 3, the Anti-Saloon League. No other organization did as much to bring about the passage of the 18th Amendment than the Anti-Saloon League. This powerful temperance organization is considered by most historians to be one of the first political pressure groups in the United States. A relative latecomer to the temperance fight, the Anti-Saloon League organized in 1892, and that happened to be the same year the village of Freeport was incorporated. However, its impact on Freeport was not felt until 1898, when it attempted to organize residents against the local option law that appeared on the ballot in the town of Hempstead. This measure failed. 2 years later, the Anti-Saloon League once again worked with the local temperance leaders to prohibit the licensing of liquor establishments. At the time, the Nassau County Review reflected local apathy towards voting against the local option by saying, quote, "But while these partisans are hoping against hope that they are the best acquainted with the situation, should know that to submit the question again would be to needingly squander the public funds." Once again, the Anti-Saloon League's push for local prohibition was unsuccessful. The Anti-Saloon League lack of success in Western Long Island did not deter it from attempts to promote a local ban on alcohol. In 1903, Reverend M.H. Fishburne, a former pastor at the Congregational Church in Rockville Center, was chosen to be the Long Island superintendent of the Anti-Saloon League. Fishburne's work in the position appears to be undistinguished. He received very little press coverage in the newspapers of Nassau and Queens County after his initial appointment. However, in the years before the passage of the Prohibition Amendment, local newspapers covered numerous Anti-Saloon League sponsored lectures in Freeport churches. Thomas H. Reed, legislative agent of the Anti-Saloon League, addressed the Methodist Church in 1907 and 1908. Reverend James A. Patterson gave an address at the Presbyterian Church in 1910. And in 1915, the Methodist Church welcomed Frank J. Burke, who was the legislative superintendent of the Anti-Saloon League. In December 1915, the Anti-Saloon League sponsored an anti-alcohol rally in Freeport. Its distinguished speaker was Spanish-American war hero and Alabama Congressman Richard Pearson Hobson, who in 1911 introduced a prohibition bill to ban alcohol, gave a lecture theme, "Destroying the Great Destroyer," at the Freeport Presbyterian Church. A year after the ratification of the National Prohibition Act in 1918, Freeport's Protestant churches, at the urging of the Anti-Saloon League, encouraged their congregants to join the Allied Citizens of America. This organization was formed to promote the enforcement of prohibition. 3 months before the passage of the federal enforcement legislation known as the Volstead Act, the Allied Citizens of America published the Card of the New Covenant as part of its membership drive. Okay, Cycle 4, World War I. In the lead up to World War I, anti-German feelings began to emerge after a series of instances. In 1915, a German U-boat sank the Lusitania, killing 123 Americans. That same year, German nationalist Erich Munter detonated a bomb in the U.S. Capitol building. Soon after the explosion, Munter left Washington, D.C. for New York. Arriving on Long Island, he forced his way into the Long Island home of J.P. Morgan. The powerful banker was shot twice by Munter, but was saved by his butler, who incapacitated the intruder with a large piece of coal to the head. In July 30th, 1916, German saboteurs later targeted the largest munitions depot in the United States, located on Black Tom Island, across the Hudson River from Manhattan. The resulting explosion blew out windows in the New York Public Library located on 42nd Street, broke water mains in the city, and caused $20 million in damage. The explosion was so great, a Freeport policeman began looking for the source of the explosion in the village. In Freeport is reported that the local German American resident and Socialist Party member Charles Lenker got into a fight at the Charles Johnson Hotel. The fight was the result of Lenker's support of Germany. According to one report, Lenker exclaimed, "The Kaiser wouldn't have President Wilson clean his streets. That's what I think about Wilson. As to the American flag, I would not wipe my hands with it. How about that?" In another account, Lenker is accused of saying, "Fine, the American flag is no flag. It is a dirty rag. It isn't fit to wash my dirty hands," and singing, "Germany over everything." His statements caused a fight in which Lenker needed 6 stitches. It also led to his arrest. It's also interesting to report, in 1918, the local paper reported that, quote, "the language of the Hun is dropped in high school." America's entry into World War I caused the public to favor Prohibition, so it was mostly associated with patriotism, especially since America's beer brewers were mostly of German heritage. In 1917, Congress passed the Lever Act, which prohibited the use of grain in the production of alcoholic beverages. Freeport's temperance movement ended when national prohibition went into effect on midnight, January 16, 1920. To celebrate, the members of the local Women's Christian Temperance Union gathered at the Presbyterian Church in Hempstead. Here the faithful exclaimed, "Let us see that no Bolshevik liquor interest shall ever tear the 18th Amendment from the Constitution of the United States." Prohibition celebrations would be short-lived. Like the growing majority of Americans, many of Long Island's best citizens were, quote, "at most lukewarm to the National Prohibition Act." Even the most taciturn citizens, according to the Long Island Forum article about Prohibition, were influenced by the money involved in illegal rum running. In 1924, the New York Times described the influence of rum running money in Freeport this way, quote, "A trip around the Freeport canals indicated that the rum trade was excellent. Fishermen who used to take out parties of landlubbers at $3 a head for a day's sport have become owners of pretentious cars. Many of these stand beside fishing shacks that formerly knew no other vehicle than a wheelbarrow. In communities where bootlegging and rum running flourished, support of prohibition enforcement prompted the organization of Taverns, and Freeport was no exception. After the Klan's first meeting in Freeport in 1922, one newspaper expressed its support of the organization by writing this: "There are places in Nassau County where the law is laughed at every day and night in the year, and places that have defied the authorities ever since the Volstead Act became law. If the Ku Klux Klan is contemplating putting the fear of God in these law violators, it would be doing a service to the community, and one that will be commendable." Temperance leaders, law enforcement, and even the KKK had little success in stopping the sale and distribution of alcohol in Freeport. Arrest records for Freeport during the Prohibition era show that nearly 1/3 of all arrests in Freeport were alcohol related, and that is between 1920 and 1933. The temperance movement in Freeport began with local churches and temperance societies such as the Women Christian Temperance Union and the Anti-Saloon League. These groups were unsuccessful banning the sale of alcohol within the village of Freeport. However, National prohibition was ultimately achieved through a constitutional amendment. Even though the law that went into effect in 1920, it was doubtful that Freeport was ever really dry. The 18th Amendment was successful in securing Freeport's notorious reputation for rum running and bootlegging. This reputation would last until Prohibition's repeal in 1943. So that concludes this program on the history of temperance, and stay tuned for some more programs. Thank you.